Hello and welcome to our webinar. Today we're going to be covering the topic of eating to boost brain health and ease symptoms. We're joined by some lovely panelists. We have Associate Professor Yasmine Probst, Adrian Stone and Mary Webb. I will be your facilitator. My name is Jane Gilliland and I'm one of the MS Nurse Advisors here. In the spirit of reconciliation, MS Plus acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So let's learn a bit more about who we've got online. Firstly, we've got Associate Professor Yasmine Probst. She is an Associate Professor with the School of Medical, Indigenous and Health Sciences at the University of Wollongong and Research Fellow at the Illawarra Health and Medical Research Institute. She holds dual master's degrees in dietetics and health informatics and is recognised as an advanced accredited practicing dietitian with Dietitians Australia and a fellow of the Australasian Institute for Digital Health. Yasmine holds a current senior research fellowship with MS Australia, and as a person living with MS, Yasmine's research and teaching focuses on nutrition for people living with MS. Welcome, Yasmine.
Thank you.
And Adrian. Adrian is a qualified nutritionist with over 10 years of experience. Adrian is a co-founder of Living Holistic Health and has dedicated his time and passion into treating his patients holistically. Adrian uses carefully tailored nutrition plans along with specific nutrients and herbs to treat health concerns, empowering his patients to take charge of their health and well-being. Welcome, Adrian.
Hello.
And finally, we have Mary. Mary is a person living with MS and has kindly agreed to join us today. Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome. Hi.
So thank you all for joining us and welcome to everyone watching online. I'd like to start by getting a better understanding of the health professionals that we have online. So Adrian, we'll start with you. What is a nutritionist?
Well, a nutritionist is someone who has a skilled understanding of the role that diet and food can play in health, basically, and is taught how to implement those strategies with patients, how to talk to people about the role of nutrition in health and their life and the impact that certain foods can have on their health and well-being. So really it's about trying to help people maximize their health potential through their diet, basically.
Thank you. And Yasmine, you're a dietitian. So what is a dietitian then?
So I guess I'm a nutritionist and a dietitian. So it's really evidence-based understanding of how food can affect our health. So having those one-on-one consultations with people around the effect of food in their life, having particular consults with people around chronic conditions and the management of those and how best to further their goals. We work in a number of different disciplines and a number of different fields, I suppose, as well, where we can be in a community setting, in a hospital setting. You'll find dietitians popping up everywhere these days, and some of us do call ourselves nutritionists, which makes it even more tricky.
Thank you. Mary, I'd like to go to you now. As a person living with MS, how did the way you think about food change after you were diagnosed with MS?
Okay, so I was diagnosed back in 1995, and at that time, I don't know, nobody mentioned diet to me, and it was pre-internet, and so really I didn't know much except what I borrowed in one library book, which was very medical, and I really didn't really start considering my diet for a few more years when I started to see some sort of MS-specific diet books and things come out, and then I looked into them, and I've got like a science background myself, so I kind of looked at it that way, evidence-based. But I've never followed any of the, I'm aware of the diets, but I don't follow any of them specifically, the MS related diets. And I mostly actually try and follow what the MS Society advises, because I know it's like evidence-based. So, and I was on the modifiable lifestyle factors panel a few years ago, so I was really interested in that. And yeah, so the advice there I kind of follow, and try not to get too stressed, but mostly try and I guess mostly just avoid processed food, and just try and sort of, but also not stress too much if I eat a piece of cake. But anyway, I'll let the experts, they'll give you more information than I ever can.
Thank you, Mary. Yasmine, can you tell us a bit more about these MS-specific diets that are out there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are many of them. So it's quite overwhelming as someone who's newly diagnosed, for example. If you type in MS diet into the internet, my goodness, it's not something I recommend doing, I have to say that much. But I guess the most important thing to think about is there's no one best diet. The current advice is really to follow the Australian Dietary Guidelines. So the evidence-based practice that is out there for the general population is where we're at. But there are so many different alternatives to diets in the MS community. So some recommend various restrictions, some recommend various inclusions, some are very difficult to follow, some are easier to follow. But I mean, the main thing is we know lots of people make changes when they're diagnosed. More than 90% of people with MS make a change to their eating pattern. And we aren't all the same. So it's about thinking about what works best for you and what works best for your family or your environment that you're working in. So if something really restrictive works for you, so be it. It's something that you can test out. Food is generally quite safe in the short term, so there shouldn't be any major problems. But if you do decide to go down a certain path in the long term, then I would definitely suggest that you go and see a dietitian, just to make sure that there's nothing out of whack behind the scenes.
Thank you, Yasmine. And what does the research tell us about these specific diets? Is there any kind of strong evidence or any research at all that kind of backs up these individual diets?
So there's definitely emerging research coming through over the last 5 or so years. It's been increasing a lot. There have been some of the restrictive diets studying particular elements of disease management, so various symptoms in particular. So fatigue is often targeted as one of those areas. And the overall space, I guess, for nutrition and MS research is that we're still quite inconsistent. There's no one diet that's best, and even of certain diets, they aren't necessarily showing the same outcomes as they repeat their studies. So we've still got a long way to go, but I think we can learn a lot from other areas that are a little bit more established as well.
Thank you. And Adrian, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on how someone might go about figuring out what is best for them, because some people respond differently to different foods and different diets.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, but before I say anything, I just want to make 2 points. And the first thing is that there's any advice that anyone's listening to, be that from myself or anything that you're getting off the internet, please make sure that you do run it past a healthcare practitioner first before you implement anything. Your neurologist, GP, whoever that might be that you see, it's very important just to double check from a safety point of view. And then secondly, with all this, as Yasmine said, with all of these dietary approaches and things, there is no cure for MS. There's at the moment, we still don't know. So just bear that in mind too, because some of the things that you see on the internet might say, specifically do this or specifically do that, and you'll miraculously, resolve your symptoms. And it's just not the case. So just bear those 2 things in mind before you, put anything into practice. But in terms of figuring out, what might work best for you, it's often a case of just the way that I view things with my patients is looking at them as an individual. So I tend to focus on the individual person, their individual circumstances, their health history, their family dynamics as well, as opposed to just focusing on the disease, the MS. I suppose that's the most important thing. And finding out a bit about the history and other things that might be going on in their body. How's their digestion? Do they have any problems digesting certain foods, which might give a bit of a clue as to what might be or may not be aggravating them. How much processed food is in their diet, for example. So that might be a target to try to balance that towards a more whole food based approach rather than a packet and refined food based approach. But really, it's, I guess, when people are looking at these things, the key thing to keep in mind is to try to, as an overarching strategy, is to try and get to a more inclusive, whole food based, broad spectrum nutrition approach. I think that's probably the most appropriate thing, broadly speaking, because more nutrition and more nutrients in your diet is going to be better for you overall, because your body wants nutrients to function, whether that's protein, carbohydrates, fats, etc. So, minerals, vitamins, all that sort of thing. So the more that you can include, I believe, in your daily diet, that the better off your body is going to be overall, because you're supplying the nutrients that it needs, and that's going to take a bit of the extra pressure off your body as from an overall perspective, and make it less stressed when it's getting the nutrients that it needs, and that indirectly will be helping your MS anyway. So have a look at, my key take home would be, don't necessarily be too restrictive if you don't have to be, and try and be as inclusive as you possibly can be.
Thank you. That's such good advice, and a positive way to think about it, as opposed to a negative way. Yasmine, what can you tell us about diet and the role it plays in brain health?
Oh, wow, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, there are a few foods that are kind of targeted as brain healthy foods. We've heard about salmon, nuts, blueberries, leafy greens, a whole range of different food items that have been flagged in the past as being good for your brain. And that was really based around certain nutrients that were common to those foods. So, your omega-3 fats, or your polyphenols, which is it's not quite a nutrient, but it's a nutrient type component of foods, or some of the more established vitamins like choline, for example. So these are moving in the direction of where we're hoping nutrition science should be going. So moving away from that single nutrient focus towards that whole food approach, and then whole pattern of eating approach. So if we combine different foods that are whole foods and good for us together in certain ways, that overall package is going to have a better effect than just targeting one particular food item all the time. But the idea of, you are what you eat, those sayings are really quite important to think about when it comes to brain health, because we know that our brain and our gut are really closely connected, and we know that what happens, what we eat, it gets digested, and what happens in our gut actually has an effect on our cognition, for example, or our mood, or our feelings, or who knows, like lots of different factors that can happen in our brain are actually having an effect as a result of what has gone into our body beforehand. So there's quite a strong link between brain health and food that's happening there. And I think that's one of the things that we need to think about in relation to food types, diets, but also then that environmental factor, like Adrian was saying as well. How is food consumed? Who's it consumed with? That whole social context of eating as well, to make us feel better.
I love that you've also brought in the other purposes of food, because I think everyone knows that food is fuel, but often that's kind of lower on the list, where might maybe eating for celebration, or to get together, a sense of community. In different cultures, food has different roles. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Adrian, back to gut health. We hear a lot about things like prebiotics and probiotics. What is the difference between those two things, and what do they do?
Good question. So probably an easy way to conceptualize it, if you like, is, so prebiotic foods are foods that are good for your gut bugs in your, what we call the gut microbiome. So they are the fuel source that your gut bacteria and other gut microbes like to eat, so that they can survive and thrive and produce the chemicals and things that they do, and that we rely on for health, of which we're learning more and more about as things go on. There's lots and lots of research on it at the moment, which I'm sure Yasmine's quite across. But so prebiotics are the fuel source for your gut bacteria, and then probiotics are actually often given as supplements. So they're bacteria that are basically packaged in a supplement, or they can actually be certain organisms that are in our gut that can potentially be beneficial for our health, but it does depend on a bit of the research behind them, and they can do certain things. So certain probiotics can produce certain metabolites or stuff that's good for us, and can help our bodies regulate inflammation in the gut and produce these certain chemicals, which when they're being produced in our gut can then travel around our body and help it just function better. So we're still, with the probiotics, we're still learning about what they do, what different bacteria are, what effects they have on our health. So there's still lots and lots of research being done. We're still getting a much clearer understanding as the days and weeks and months roll on about what they do. And certainly prebiotics are, things, for example, that might be in certain foods. So you might have heard of things like resistant starches, for example, and fibre. So things like soluble and insoluble fibre, foods that are, have high components of those, fruits and vegetables and legumes and things, which when we eat them at the right levels are very, very good for our gut bacteria. So that's the main difference between the two.
Okay, so we've got to eat to feed the bacteria.
Yes, well, exactly. We are learning more about the impact that the bacteria have on our health, and certainly very often to get a good result from our gut bacteria, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to supplement with a probiotic or something like that. If we can focus on the fuel source for them, so the different types of whole foods that we can actually introduce more of into our diet, increasing dietary fiber or using resistant starches and that sort of thing, you can actually have a positive effect on your gut microbiome without needing to have probiotics supplementally or anything like that.
Thank you. That's a really good tip, because I think it's very easy to walk into a chemist or a health food shop and be overwhelmed by supplements. So really great to hear that some of those foods that we may already know of can be helpful as well. I'd like to talk a bit about MS symptoms. There are a great deal of MS symptoms, but commonly we might think of things like fatigue or changes to cognition, maybe bladder and bowel changes, heat intolerance, spasms, spasticity. Mary, I'd like to hear from you, if that's okay. Have you found a relationship at all between what you're eating and drinking and how your MS symptoms might impact you day to day?
Probably the only thing I can really link is fatigue. I think like really eating healthy helps me not be as fatigued, and which is always a good thing. So unrelated to other things, whether I'm getting enough sleep or anything as well, just diet, trying to stay on a good diet really helps with fatigue. And of course, and my because I'm working in as an editor, so I'm always having to think, and cognition is a problem sometimes for me. So again, eating healthy, I guess I'm always just targeting my worst symptoms, which is like cognition and fatigue, and other things like pain. I guess I have never really noticed an association with diet. So yeah, I suppose fatigue and cognition mostly, and yeah, just basically that, not really targeting any particular foods, but just that healthy diet more than anything else. Okay.
And Yasmine, I'm keen to clarify something, and I think you'd be the one. When we say diet, we're not necessarily meaning this special diet that someone's made or this special diet. Diet can be the word that just describes what I consume in a day, but it can also be a formulated plan, can't it? So it means both when we're talking about diet. Is that right?
It definitely does, yes. I mean, over the years, it was known as, diet, dieting or something along those lines. Now it's used a lot more loosely as a term to talk about our eating pattern. So we might be following a particular diet in that traditional sense, or our diet might be healthy eating, for example, but they're both talking about the foods that are going into our body.
And what do you know from your understanding of research and dietetics and MS? Can diet impact the symptoms of MS?
Ooh, still early stage, but like I was saying before, there are a few different approaches that are being tested out there that haven't conclusively shown us that there is an effect of X on Y. But we're definitely seeing movement in the right direction. So as the research continues to progress, and as we're seeing more and more studies focusing on nutrition in the right way, because some studies in the past have been challenging, we're definitely seeing some positive outcomes and some more consistency coming through. But I'd say fatigue is probably the most common one that's being targeted. And I'd say what Mary was saying before around the idea of focusing on the types of foods that you're putting into your body, making sure that you put the right fuel into your body to keep it moving and continuing to function the way that you need it to function is really important there. And just thinking about what works best for you as a person. So you don't have to follow someone's diet as it's written on paper. You can work out your own based on what your symptoms are doing and for you, and what your family situation or your environment is doing for you as well.
And Yasmine, may it also be that it's not specific to MS, for example, but if you kind of haven't eaten all day, then that might affect your cognition if you've got low blood sugar or you're not well hydrated, for example. So could there be some basic principles that impact?
For sure, definitely. I know I get hangry very easily. So if I don't eat when my tummy tells me to eat, my goodness, you don't want to be there. But yes, there definitely is an effect of food on a number of different factors. So making sure that you remember to hydrate yourself, particularly when we have hot weather, which we're sadly moving away from. But you know, those kind of basic principles of eating are really, really important, because that fuel for our body to keep us moving is needed by anyone, whether you've got a diagnosis with MS or not. But I think for us, as people living with MS, sometimes we do need to think a little bit more carefully about the choices we make. So if we know we're making choices that aren't necessarily as desirable as they could be for ourselves, then maybe swapping some of those choices over to something that could be slightly better informed. So, you know, for example, instead of choosing to have a snack bar of some sort, maybe swapping that to a healthier snack, rather like a piece of fruit or some vegetables or some crackers or nuts or so on. You know, those active decisions in small baby steps, essentially long term, can form into nice habits that you can move into the future with.
And something as a nurse that I hear about is just how simple some of the things can be. So for example, I've spoken with a client who experiences heat intolerance, and he finds that even eating a really hot dinner is enough to kind of have that effect of heat intolerance, because a really hot soup is in effect just putting something hot inside your body, and if your core body temperature is raised by that, then that can have that impact. And I also hear my nurse advisor colleague Bridie talking a lot about things that can impact bladder and bowel, so things that might be irritants or lack of hydration. So there can be some things we learn that are quite general to bladder and bowel health that might not be specific to MS, for example. Adrian, for someone who is starting out and wanting to maybe make some changes towards a healthier or more nutritious diet, what are your tips just to get someone started?
First thing, get some advice from a health professional, not the internet. It's a treasure trove of there's rabbit holes and burrows you just don't need to go down. And it's, you know, half the things if you're on the internet, you're going to get cancer, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. It's really difficult to navigate. So my best advice would be, firstly, consult with a health professional, someone who's experienced in helping people with MS, who's got, you know, bachelor degree or higher qualification, who's happy to work with neurologists, who's happy to work with GPs, all of that sort of thing, to make sure that get yourself a good team. So get yourself a good neurologist, good GP, good neurophysio, whatever the experts are in their disciplines, and get them around you to support you, firstly. But yes, so first thing, get a health nutrition professional on board. And then it is a case of making sure that, I think, as Yasmine's said as well, it's not just MS you need to think about. You need to think about yourself and your whole health history. So, you know, there might be some other things going on that have nothing to do with MS, but could be impacting the way that your body responds to certain foods. So say, for example, I've got a patient at the moment who is diagnosed with PCOS and has got, you know, issues with blood glucose and with insulin levels. So for that person, you know, we're going to be looking at food a slightly different way and looking at refined carbohydrates and things in much more detail, and being more closely monitored and than somebody else. So don't just think of the MS, always think about your whole health, your health history, and get a health professional on board to help you navigate what's going to be the best approach for you. All right.
I love that. It is so different for everybody, and you're exactly right. There's not just the MS. You're a whole person before you get diagnosed with MS, and you've got a whole future as well that isn't just MS.
The way that we try and practice is it's treat the person, not the disease. So it's really about treating you as an individual. What works best for you, what nutrition is going to be best for you, what medication is going to be best for you. It's you as an individual. Don't ever forget that.
Thank you. That's such a good point. We hear a lot these days, and you mentioned before, about actually adding things into the diet, that being a focus rather than what do I need to cut and what's good and bad food. What are some foods that people living with MS might benefit from including in their diet?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I like to talk to my patients about that whole fruit approach, and really targeting fruits and vegetables, which we know that a lot of the majority of the Australian population don't necessarily meet their basic nutrition targets as dictated by the healthy eating guidelines that have been proposed. So really making that a focus, making sure that we're inclusive of lots of brightly coloured fruits and vegetables. They don't necessarily have to be fresh. If you're to get if blueberries are a fruit that we want to get in, for example, it might be easy for you to have some frozen in the freezer. That way you can put it in with your porridge in the morning. As a general thing to help you get those targets up. So really targeting fresh fruits and vegetables, and just minimizing the amount of refined foods that you're having. So limiting the amount of things you have in a packet. So the things you have with a barcode, you want to minimize those, because generally speaking, the more processed the food is, the more good nutrients have been stripped out of it potentially, and the more preservatives and other oils and things which aren't necessarily so good for us have been added to it. So if you can minimize the amount of those sorts of foods and include more of your whole food type things into the diet, it's going to generate a more positive response, broadly speaking, for you.
And I think it's such a different way of looking at it than some of that diet culture that we hear about, which is food's being good or bad, and I've got to cut things out, and I'm being bad. Yasmine, I'm keen to hear from you. What are some things to be conscious of when we're thinking about dietary changes? Things of such as like restrictive eating or control or deprivation or guilt. What should we be mindful of if we're trying to make some changes?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first approaches for me is don't do the takeaway, what can't I eat? It's more, what can I eat? Focus on the positive and focus on that approach that works for you. I think there's so much stress with saying, I can't eat this, I can't eat that, I can't eat this. And then you go for a grocery shop, for example, and you don't know what to put in your trolley because there are so many I can't eats. So if you think about the positive there and what I can eat, and what the positive effects are of those foods. Like Adrian was saying, having lots of brightly coloured fruits and vegetables. For me, I love the idea of a rainbow, thinking about having a rainbow on your plate and as many colours as possible. That's a nice, straightforward way to think about things. But yes, labelling things and giving the good and bad for food items is not really something that I like to move towards. And I know for some people, it's just a point of no-go. And they just throw their hands up and say, okay, this is all too hard. And that's not what we'd like to see.
Yeah, that's right.
Mary, since being diagnosed with MS, how have you, I suppose, thought or changed your internal dialogue? You spoke before about trying not to feel guilty and those types of things. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think over time, because I've been diagnosed for a long time, I was probably more stressed about it. Well, I wasn't stressed at all at the start when there was no information. And then I was, I guess, more conscious of it, but in a kind of negative way, trying to really not restrict it, but try and work that out. And I guess over time I've just become more relaxed. I don't feel that there's any food groups that particularly bother me. I've had more things happening, like I've got not a great family history of bowel cancer, so I guess actually that aspect has kind of almost overtaken because I kind of feel comfortable with the MS side of things. I kind of but again, the diet the diet that's good for reducing risk of bowel cancer is pretty much the same advice we're hearing for MS, so it's not too difficult. So I guess my focus has changed a bit, but I do also always have that emphasis that that don't stress too much, because the stress itself is not good. So yeah, and sometimes, as we were saying about the sort of social and cultural aspects, like if socializing with your friend and having going to a cafe and having something that's maybe some cake or something, if the whole experience is really positive and that's giving you reducing your stress and helping you generally, I don't swear off everything like that if it's got a positive benefit. And I just try and not think about it too much, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. As you said, and we've all been speaking about, it's not just fuel, but it represents something more. And you would hate to think of someone going to their neurologist appointment to review an MRI, and the neurologist says, oh my gosh, there's 3 new lesions. Did you eat Christmas lunch? You know, like, it's just not that likely to happen, is it? I mean, if you really gave it a nudge, I'm sure with diet we could, you know, really influence brain health in that way, but it doesn't have to be as dramatic as missing out on those things that are really important. Adrian, I'm keen to hear from you about some tips for people who might be feeling, look, I'm really busy and I'm impacted by fatigue and other symptoms, and I just don't feel like I've got the time to prepare healthy, nutritious meals. What are some suggestions on how to eat a more balanced diet or add in those healthier things without spending too much time on all of this?
So if you can find a partner who's a chef, it's going to really. But aside from that, you can't find one of them. All right. So first thing is, don't get too stressed. Firstly, there's some simple things that you can do to make your life a lot easier. So say, for example, you don't necessarily have the time to go out and get all the vegetables to buy a stir fry mix, for example, or get all the ingredients to get a salad. Well, just go to the supermarket and get the pre-packaged fresh stuff that's on the shelf already ready for you, and just have that. Also, like I was saying before with frozen food, like, it's better to have some frozen fruits and vegetables than none. So have those in your freezer. So if you're running a little bit stressed for time, you can always just whip those out and heat those up, and at least you've got the food there ready to go. And that'll save you too on things like waste, for example. If you're running tight, if you're time poor and you bought these things that have been sitting in your fridge and they go off, well, if you've got some frozen stuff there, at least you've got that as backup if you ever need it. So that's one way to do it. And the other thing too is, with this colder weather, don't ever discount the benefits of batch cooking. So say, for example, if you've got a slow cooker or something like that at home, before if you're off to work, you can put everything in there in the slow cooker before you go in the morning. Then you go to work and you get home and it's done. It's all ready for you. You just take that straight out of the slow cooker and eat it. And with the batch cooking as well, you can have some things for lunches. So you might be able to do, so let's say, for example, you've got a Sunday free, one day a week, or some time free on the weekends. You might be able to dedicate some time to doing some meal prep. You do some batches. You might do a frittata. You might do whatever it might be, a casserole, and then you just batch it up and put it into individual boxes and freeze it. I've had some clients who have had a chefing background, and the things they have told me, and the extents they go to plan out their week, is just, wow, it's mind-blowing. It's awesome. But they have all the individual containers, and they're all labeled, and the freezer's all documented with, this is Monday, this is Tuesday, this is Wednesday, this is Thursday. It's amazing. But you can do that for yourself in a more simple way, and just basically have your meals as a larger portion and batch it out, freeze them, have some ready to go for the next day or the morning just in the fridge, and that'll save you a lot of time. The other thing that you can do is, there are, if you're running short on time for shopping, there are services that you can get that do deliver to your house. Might be a slightly increased expense for the delivery, but it might just be something that, if time is your enemy, then that can at least bring the food to your house rather than you having to go out and shop. So that might be something that you could look at doing as well, which would save you a bit of time. But at least that way you've still got that food there ready to go for yourself to eat, rather than, because often the worst enemy is time. And when you're out of time and you haven't got the food done, of course you're going to have to go for something more convenient. And generally speaking, if it's more convenient, it's going to be more processed, maybe not as good for you as you would want.
They're really good tips. And another thing with some of those tips you've given is that they also work for reducing the impact on fatigue and things like that. Because if you're able to delegate walking around the shop and putting things in the trolley to someone else, then you save some energy. And by searching online, sometimes it's easier to actually save money, because you can, with a one-click, sort by price for you, by unit, for example. So that's a really good tip. And that kind of speaks to a fatigue management principle we know of called grading, which actually talks about the way that you do a task. So there could be, on one end, it could be growing the carrots yourself from scratch, to buying them and standing up and chopping them individually, to buying them pre-cut up in a bag, to buying them already cooked. That's kind of grading, making something easier. So there's such good tips. In terms of more tips from you, because we need a lot of takeaway messages from today, cost of living's going up, and it can feel like a barrier to get fresh produce, or not just fresh, but healthy produce. What are some of your tips to eating well when the budget is low or even lower?
So I'll refer to my first point, get a chef, because they can do the whole household budget for you. Yeah, that's takeaway number one. But failing that, so one of the things that I spoke about before is minimize waste. So it might be, for example, that you only have a certain portion or a couple of days worth of your fresh fruit and vegetables but you have a lot of frozen stuff. So that's saving you on waste. So you're not necessarily spending and replenishing things you're not using if you're running low on time. That's the first thing. And the second thing is with the batch cooking, and in particular the slow cookers, you can use cheaper cuts of meat, right, in your meals. So you're not having to spend a lot, because meat's quite expensive, generally speaking. So you can save yourself a lot of money that way by using the cheaper cuts and slow cooking them. They'll still taste delicious. They'll give you the nutrition that you need, but it'll be cheaper for you. All right. The other thing that you can do is you can look for, I don't know if you've heard of farmer's pick. I'm not sure if you've got that in your locality where you are, but there is fruit and vegetables that are available that have failed the supermarket test, I suppose, in terms of looking presentable. So a carrot might be a bit bent, or a cucumber might look a little bit strange, or something like that. So you can actually save a lot of money if you actually shop through one of those organisations to get your fresh fruit and vegetables, for example. And farmers markets is another great way to go. So if you're able to, if you have the time, or if somebody you know has the time to be able to go out to a farmers market and do the shopping for you, again, you might be able to save a bit that way, where you can actually get direct from the farmer or closer to it, and cutting out the middleman of the supermarket or whatever. It might save you some money doing it that way too.
Thank you. And Yasmine, I'm keen to hear your tips here.
Just to add to what Adrian's already said, I like the idea of buying in bulk. Like, I know for many people, they look at the upfront cost and go, oh dear, this is not good. But in the long term, you'll be using that product over a longer period of time. And if you, for example, buy a bulk amount of mince and portion it down into smaller amounts and pop it in the freezer, you've got mince available to you for a number of different dishes that when you're filling up to cooking. So for example, if fatigue hits you at nighttime, don't cook at nighttime, cook your meal in the morning and pop it in the fridge ready for nighttime for your dinner. So for buying in bulk is really handy for the meat side of things. But there are also some shared schemes where you can actually purchase products with others in your community and save on the discount of buying in bulk, but you're not yourself having to do the bulk buying. It's actually a community approach. So there are a few different approaches like that around in various areas. I like to do the grow your own. That's something that works for me to keep my mental health at bay. So I like fiddling around in the garden, getting my nails dirty, and seeing the idea of growing my own product and then making it into something, but that's not always a possibility for people. But yes, definitely keeping in mind that shopping local is often a good approach to go with. So, having a chat with locals, looking for local community groups, community gardens sometimes. They're nice, affordable approaches to making use of excess resources that some other people might have, and you can swap products that you might have with them, and it's often cost neutral then as well. So just thinking outside the square, that we don't always have to go to the supermarket to get our products, and some of those local approaches might be something that can work for people as well.
And Yasmine, might there also be some staples like brown rice or lentils or beans that people might not be familiar with that are actually pretty decent if you know how to cook them and are quite low in unit cost?
For sure, and they're also quite shelf stable as well. So they're the type of products where if you have them sitting in your pantry as your, I guess, emergency supply that's there for when times are tough, and you have a few nice meals that you can make, they often have a very low cost for the whole meal as a package. But yes, making use and becoming aware of what those different options are. So you've mentioned a few there already today, but even your dried beans and so on, you just have to rehydrate them in water. It's quite simple. Pop them into soups. I think soups are one of the easiest things to make. It's almost fail safe. But it's a nice, easy way to use up leftovers as well. So if you've got leftover fruit and veg sitting in your chiller, then you can just chop them up, pop them into your pot, and make a batch of goodness knows what soup. But as the weather's getting a bit colder, soup is one of those nice ones that can be conveniently made in a large portion as well. Depending on your taste preferences, you can pop all sorts of different things into it.
Thank you. They're great tips. We've actually had some questions sent in by our clients. So we're going to go to some questions. The first one's for you, Yasmine, actually. Are there foods that reduce inflammation or make inflammation worse?
There are. So the term inflammation has been used a lot in recent years, and there are definitely foods that are known to be more inflammatory, I suppose, than others. but that's not to say that we have to completely stop eating them either. They're usually foods that you know to be less beneficial for you. So for example, processed meats aren't as beneficial for us as some might like to think. So swapping those processed meats out for a leaner cut or for fish or poultry, you know, something is quite straightforward. It's still a meat choice, but the composition of the meat overall is probably better for your health in the long run. You know, the idea of inflammatory foods also tends to include beverages. So alcohol is labelled as a bit inflammatory. And we all know that alcohol is not something that's necessarily recommended on a daily basis. So giving yourself some alcohol-free days if you do choose to drink alcohol, and limiting the amount that you do consume or swapping it out for another better option is quite good in that space. But yes, there definitely are some inflammatory foods. I think the effect it has on each person does differ. As we know with MS, it's a unique condition. Each of us has a different experience of it. And I think it's not a case of, oh, this food is going to be inflammatory for me because it's inflammatory for the next person. So work out what works for you, like I've said a few times.
And what about reducing inflammation? Are there any magic foods or drinks that can reduce inflammation?
Ooh, there sadly aren't any magic foods, as much as I would love to be able to say that there are, but there aren't. It's more of a combination of those whole foods that we know are good for us. So keeping an eye on the balance of colours, like we've already spoken about, because the colour is actually representative of the components in the food. And the different colours have different effects on our body and what our body can do. So having lots of colours is a nice, easy strategy to move forward with when we're going to the grocery store or when we're creating a meal in our kitchen as well.
So that bowl of M&Ms that we have near our desk, that's perfect because they're all different colours.
Ooh, let's go with whole foods there a little bit as well. Again,
one last question.
The occasion M&Ms are fine too.
Yeah, well, I don't know that anyone can eat one M&M. I don't know that that's possible. Second question for you, Yasmine. Someone said, I use light and easy for most of my meals. Is that a good approach, or should I supplement that in some way?
I think it's a convenient approach to eating. I mean, for a lot of us, fatigue is a big issue. Time is a big issue. And Light and Easy have actually done quite a lot of work behind the scenes to improve the products that they are providing to the consumer. So I think if it's working for you and your family, then that's something to think about, but don't keep making the same choice. So choose a few different options so that you are getting different nutrients coming through. The approach that these companies that produce the frozen meals are taking now in terms of how they create their meals is definitely a lot improved from what they were in previous years. So the components of the meals are now a lot more nutritious than they previously were, and they've worked on really bringing the salt levels down and making them better for us. So I think light and easy is not a bad choice necessarily. Obviously not the only choice for your entire day. I would definitely choose a few other foods in there, but I wouldn't necessarily steer away from it if it's working for you.
Thank you. Adrian, some questions for you. How can diet support regular bowel movements?
Well, it can work a little bit both ways. It's to do with those prebiotic foods that we sort of spoke about before. So generally speaking, the lower in those prebiotic foods that you have, particularly the fibrous sort of foods, the soluble and insoluble fiber foods, that will have potentially an effect on not making your gut work as well, and so causing some problems with your bowel motions, for example. So the first thing is to really make sure that you're hitting your targets, and generally speaking, it's mainly those fruit and vegetable targets that you need to be having to get good supply of those the contents within them to feed your gut, make it nice and healthy, feed your gut bugs, and to keep things moving through in a good normal way. That's very important to have. And also don't forget water. I mean, that's often overlooked. So making sure that you are staying hydrated. A lot of people, particularly if they're tired, if they're suffering from fatigue, might lean more towards the coffee side of things, which can dehydrate you a bit. So just make sure that you are keeping up your water intake. And again, that's good for your gut, good for the bowel, good for your gut bugs, and will help things moving through.
Thank you. And another question for you. Is gluten and dairy-free diet the best for the brain? Does a 3-day water fast assist with repairing myelin sheath?
Okay. So to the first point about gluten and dairy-free, well, it would again depend on the individual, as I was saying before. So So, for example, someone who was carrying the celiac gene and was getting some celiac symptoms and was getting elevation in celiac antibodies, for example, then yeah, they should definitely have a gluten-free diet, because they're going to be running the risk of some serious problems. So one thing I'd say about gluten-free and dairy-free diets, because they're often spoken about as being quite healthy for people by cutting out gluten or cutting out dairy. If you're cutting out gluten, don't necessarily think that just by going into a strictly gluten-free diet, it's going to be healthier. I've had patients who have done that in the past where they've gone on a gluten-free diet, but they've replaced the gluten-containing products with other products that are processed. There's plenty of gluten-free cookies and gluten-free, lollies and gluten-free this and that, and that's not going to be healthy for you necessarily if you're topping up your diet with lots of refined food. So yeah, so it would depend on some other factors. As a general rule, the majority of the population don't have that celiac tendency. So for the majority of the population, a gluten-free diet won't necessarily be a benefit, but again, it will depend on other things that are going on. And similarly with dairy, dairy, again, if you're going to be, same with anything, if you're going to be cutting or eliminating things out of your diet, you just need to get advice and make sure that you're not depleting yourself in other areas. So obviously the main thing we think about with dairy is calcium, for example. So just get some advice around that to make sure that if you want to cut dairy out of your diet, you are not running the risk of going into deficiency, and you're topping it up with other things like leafy greens as example, or tahini from sesame or something like that, just to make sure that you've got that right balance there. And if dairy doesn't sit well for you and you feel much better not having it, that's fine, but do make sure that you're not running the risk of those deficiencies. In terms of a 3-day water fast, I haven't seen any research on a 3-day water fast. Yasmine, have you seen any research on a 3-day water fast at all?
Not recently, but I haven't really been looking for it. I do know the fasting approaches have been quite popular, but the water fast I haven't seen, no.
Yeah, no, so water fast, let's say if you were doing a 3-day water fast and that was going to stop you smoking cigarettes or drinking alcohol or doing something else which was very unhealthy, then it might be a benefit because you're doing that. But as a general rule, again, not necessarily going to help you. There are, as Yasmine said, some fasting approaches that are just coming through in the research now, which look promising and interesting. Things like time-restricted eating, for example, whereby you might have heard of the 16-8 approach, where you're fasting for 16 hours and you're eating for 8. Or intermittent fasting, where you have certain caloric intake on certain days and on lower caloric intake on some other days. They're all things that are being explored now in the research, which are showing promise. So if you're looking at fasting, I'd probably suggest that you have a chat to your healthcare professional about some of those approaches rather than necessarily doing a water fast.
Thank you. Mary, I'm keen to know what tips and tricks you found helpful in eating well with MS.
I actually just thought of one while we've been talking, and it's a cost of living related one. That because I know people are often very tired in the evening, but sometimes I actually prefer shopping in the evening because there's fewer people around, especially in COVID times. And one thing I discovered, which I realise I'm not the first person to discover, is that the supermarkets offload a whole lot of their fresh produce at the end of the day. So if I go to the supermarket at 7 o'clock at night, they have this big trolley of perfectly good fruit and veggies marked down, sometimes significantly. Sometimes those packaged salads, which they're handy. And sometimes I've tried things I've never tried before because they're on special. That's like sometimes I do. But other things like pick up a whole bag of carrots for 10 cents, which always gives me joy, and things like that. So it's like, yeah, supermarkets, I know we're talking about saving in other ways, but that's just one thing I happened upon. But now I actually do, if I've got a choice, and I'm actually usually quite fine in the evening, I'll try and do my shopping then and I always look out for those bargains. And yeah, I might pick up a vegetable I don't usually eat, so I might try something different because of that, or one of those packaged salads that I might not normally buy, but I go, oh, there's this, whatever weird mix that I haven't tried, and pick that up. So, a big one for specials. Again, not like sometimes have specials that are like mega bag of salad, and I look at it and it's like the use by, and often those use bys are, you can go a couple of days past them, but they'll be a big family size bag, and I'll go, well, that's not going to be a special because I'm not going to be able to eat that in time, so therefore it's no longer a special. But it also, I don't know, I find it quite fun, so it's kind of a sport as well as a money saving tip.
Yeah, well done.
We do the same thing.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah,
that same
well
sport at our
done.
house.
No, exactly. The markdown you can get, it can be quite interesting once you start playing around with that. Yasmine, a question for you. If on disease-modifying therapy drugs like Kesimpta, which deplete our B cells, should we be eating foods to boost the immune system? It's very confusing.
Generally, MS is confusing, so that's not unusual to have a question around disease-modifying therapies and confusion, etc. So I think the main thing to keep in mind is those therapies that our healthcare team put us on, and obviously targeting our disease in a particular way because of our experience to date. The idea of boosting our immune system is something we need to be a bit careful with, because our immune system was already quite boosted, which is why we have multiple sclerosis. So we don't really want to be doing too many things to play around with that space. So I'd say, rather than worrying about foods that are going to boost your immune system, because there are definitely some supplements out there that claim that, and my suggestion would be to not go near those. But in terms of the food side of things, it's a case of looking at the overall approach to eating. So is there something you could be doing better that would be overall providing better nourishment for your body? Better nourishment for your body will have an effect on your immune system in a positive way, in conjunction with what the disease-modifying therapies are meant to be doing for you as well. So I wouldn't think about it as having to boost your system, but rather maybe boost the way you eat.
And another question, Yasmine, about calcium and vitamin D. Someone said, should I make sure I'm getting enough of these?
Well, we're really lucky living in Australia, because we do have, generally, and I say that generally, quite lovely weather outside. And if you do have the opportunity to be outside, that is how we get most of our vitamin D. We have to be careful, of course, because the SunSafe messages advise us to be aware of the times when the UV is high. UV, however, is what converts vitamin D in our skin to the right source for our body to be able to use it. So it's a really tricky space to be in when we've got such beautiful availability of the weather outside for us, and then needs for us in particular. The research, however, is showing now that vitamin D, when people have already been diagnosed, is a little bit different. So having extra vitamin D to slow progression seems to be not thought about in the same way as it was previously. We definitely need to be careful of our vitamin D. We don't need to go above and beyond too much. So I think have a chat with your healthcare team, make sure that what your readings are coming in at in terms of your vitamin D blood levels, see where they are. If you're already within range and everything's okay there, I don't think you need to be doing too much differently. If you aren't within range, then speak to your healthcare team about what they would recommend. You may need to go into supplementation, or there may be some other approaches that you could try. But definitely it's an individualized approach.
Thank you, Yasmine. And another question, does MS impact insulin levels and insulin release?
Ooh, so that's a clever question. I think it's probably not so the MS itself, it's those related, what we call comorbidities. So factors that come with the disease that might have already existed before the disease, or they might have developed as a result of the disease, and that can have the effect on our body. So if, for example, we're carrying a little bit more weight than we had previously, then we might be seeing some effects of our body not being able to manage our blood glucose levels, or our blood sugar levels the same way as it did previously, which might also have some flow-on effects to other factors in our lives. In terms of the insulin, because that is something that we need to be aware of in terms of managing blood sugars, that can be from a number of different things. I wouldn't necessarily say at this point that we're seeing it to be MS equals this, but there are some related factors that can come into play. So if you're aware that you might be carrying a little bit too much weight, that might be something to work on. That might then have an effect on your insulin levels coming back into a healthy range, and then the effect on your blood sugar levels there as well.
Thank you. Adrian, a question for you. Is fish oil beneficial when you cannot eat fish for omega-3s?
Maybe, not necessarily. A lot of people obviously know about omega-3s, and they're typically thought of as the anti-inflammatory type of fats, whereas your omega-6s, generally speaking, are thought of as your pro-inflammatory type of fats. With supplements, I'd caution people that the word supplement, just think about it, it's supplement, it's on top of, it's not a standalone. So sometimes supplements can be beneficial, but you do need to make sure that your diet has got a good representation of what you need. So, if you want to build a house, you don't just put the roof on, you have to get the base and the foundation right first, okay? So omega-3s, awesome through food. So we know fish, we know, is a very, very good source of omega-3s. Having grass-fed meat as opposed to grain-fed will increase your omega-3 profile through your meat intake. Having avocado and nuts and seeds, different types of flaxseed oil, for example, that's often recommended for people with MS to get their omega-3s up. There are loads that you can do through food, first and foremost, to get your omega-3s up. So that'd be the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say in terms of fish oil is that, as with most nutrients, because it's a very individualized thing and we all process things in different ways, the range and in the research from what's required is just so variable. There's no hard and fast rule that, yes, having fish oil is necessarily going to give you X amount of benefit. So just be cautious of that, and again, just make sure you have your chat to your healthcare professional. See if a fish oil supplement, if you want to do it, is something that's right for you and what dose you may or may not need. That would be my best advice there.
I loved the example you gave about building a house, because in terms of supplements, I've heard someone say, if I ask you to build me a house, Adrian, and that house needed 4 windows, that's what you need to build the house. But if I say, okay, so I'm going to deliver 36 windows then because I need that house built quickly, that doesn't make you build the house any faster, does it? Just because you've got extra supply. And I thought that was an interesting way of thinking of supplements. Yeah,
no, exactly. It's a very good analogy, and it's the same with Yasmine. I've read her umbrella review that she did, which was awesome, from 2020, and that was very, very detailed. It went through a lot of those nutrients that people often use when considering for MS, for example, and even it's just so inconsistent. So it's so variable. Even the dosage range that people use for vitamin D, for example, is some of the things that people have put on and the rates that they put on, like the amounts, it's mind blowing. And so people just need to be very careful when they're thinking about those supplements and make sure that they're just getting the right advice and they're not necessarily trying to put in 30 windows. Just maybe one brick at a time might be a better way to go. But do make sure you get your foundations right. Diet and lifestyle are your key. As one of the neurologists said when I did a talk last year, a very great neurologist in Geelong, well respected. MS has got a huge environmental component, so do look at diet and lifestyle as playing a role. What percentage of that role it is for you in your disease, it varies from person to person, but try and get, as we've been talking about during this webinar, a lot of those healthy behaviours from a dietary perspective and a lifestyle perspective, movement, etc., in place. It's going to help you to some extent. To what extent, we don't know, because it's so variable, but it will help to some degree.
Thank you. And I'd like to, the last question, to go to Mary. Mary, if you could go back and give yourself advice, way back when MS was pretty new to you, what advice would you give yourself, especially around food and diet?
I guess mostly just not to stress too much, because I think that's really what ends up, you tie yourself in knots as you try and follow this and get all of that conflicting information. I think over time though, like I've kind of realized where the good sources of information are, and able to kind of not necessarily dismiss, but yeah, maybe be more sort of hone in more quickly on what's actually going to be good information and what's not, like what's credible, what's not, what's research evidence-based, what's not, what's just fads and fashions, which I'm afraid do happen in MS. So things come in and out of fashion that really do seem like fads rather than actually based on a lot of rigorous science. So I guess, but yeah, overall, not to stress too much. Right.
Thank you. If we didn't get to your question, then we will respond to you via email. Just want to have a look now at some of the supports and services that MS Plus offers, especially if you're wanting some support or advice regarding your diet and nutrition. We do have an MS Plus diet nutrition service, but there's also lots of other options as well. So you can easily go online. I know that Dietitians Australia have a search tool as well, but here at MS Plus, you can see that we have Plus Connect and we have some NDIS services. I'm a nurse advisor, so if you'd like to speak with an MS nurse, you can do that. And we have peer support, support with employment, and many more things. If you're interested in information online, which is probably why you're here, have a look at our resource hub. So that's where we keep all of the webinars that we do, like this one, as well as podcasts and articles, and also our In Touch newsletter. And we've got lots of topics covered there as well. And finally, the way that you can contact us or get more information is through Plus Connect. You can email connect@msplus.org.au or call 1800 042 138. Finally, I'd like to thank our panelists who have so generously been here today. Adrian, thank you so much for joining us. And Mary, thank you for your insight. It's invaluable to hear from someone living with MS about their experiences, and also Yasmine for sharing all of your smarts as well. We'll end the webinar now, but please stay on for a short survey. Have a lovely day, and I challenge you to eat something colourful for dinner. See you later. Bye.